everything that rises much converge. Christ. A graphic novel for school, and that was... Ooh. What's up, gamers? Welcome back to hell. Today we're going to be doing my April 2021 wrap-up. We're making progress on these. You know the drill. To start, let's do some stats. In the month of April, I only read 20 books, but I did read 14 manga, none of which are being talked about or counted here. Of those 20 books, I read 3 5-star, 5 4-star, 3 3-star, 0 2-star, and 0 1-star books. I also read 9 0-star books, which includes books I read for school or books that I decided not to rate. Now, of those 20 books, I read 3 sci-fi, 2 romance, 3 nonfiction, 7 books for school, 2 horror thrillers, and 3 fantasies. The first book I read in April was a book for school, and that was Brown Girl Dreaming by Jaqueline Woodson. This is actually a poetry prose poem comprised of quite a few different smaller poems that account Jaqueline Woodson's childhood, growing up in South Carolina and New York City back and forth. I enjoyed it. It was probably one of the more enjoyable books that I read kind of in the school year, but I didn't rate it because I don't rate books that I read for school. However, next I read the entire Red Rising trilogy by Pierce Brown, and I gave every single one of these books 5 stars. Now, I had never done that for a series before, given every single book the highest possible rating, but I just absolutely loved this series. It was so much fun. I enjoyed it from start to finish. I ended up reading 1 book each day and like a total weekend binge, and it was so much fun. The series starts with Red Rising. The whole universe is this dystopia, but we're specifically focused on the community in Mars. Society is divided up into colors: red, pink, purple, gold, and the lowest rung of society are the Reds, which is what our main character is. The Reds are tasked with mining this very specific mineral in underground Mars so that the surface of Mars can be terraformed for the higher ranks of society. However, our main character, Darrow, finds out that things may not be exactly what it seems or what perhaps they have all been told for their whole lives, and it just becomes this epic martial fantasy. I did enjoy all of these books equally. I haven't picked up Iron Gold and Dark Age yet. I'm kind of waiting for them to announce when the 3rd book in that trilogy is approximately going to be released, because I don't want to read next part of the series and then realize I have to wait like 3 years. Yeah, that was Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Next, I read The Shadows by Alex North. Alex North is also the same author who wrote The Whisper Man, which I read last year, and I really enjoyed this. I ended up giving this book 4 stars, and it was such an excellent horror thriller. It focuses on dual timelines, one when our main character is a child and one when our main character is now an adult returning to a small town, and the events that took place when he was a child, when several of his friends from school brutally murdered one of their classmates. He's trying to understand more about what happened in the past and maybe how that's affecting him now in the present. Personally, I loved this a lot more than The Whisper Man. I think that this did lean more into the horror, whereas I think The Whisper Man was more of a thriller, and I like that. I love horror as a genre, so this really appealed to me, and there were also things in it that are like my specific fears that I just found bone chilling, which was such a fun thing to read about. I love to be terrified by books. 4 stars to The Shadows by Alex North. I highly recommend it. Next, I read another book for school, which means I did not rate it, and that is Wind from an Enemy Sky by Darcy McNickle. This book is about a fictional Native American tribe in a fictional town that has just been completely decimated by the white settlers building a dam and redirecting the water away from their village. Just interpersonal strife that results from that decision. And it was a very interesting book to read. It wasn't my favorite of ones that I read this semester or even for this class, but I did find it interesting. Next, I read The Library Book by Susan Orlean, and I gave this 3 stars. This is a nonfiction book accounting the massive fire that completely destroyed the Los Angeles Public Library and Susan Orlean's journalistic search to understand what caused the fire and maybe a broader conversation about the history of libraries themselves and why they are important to society. But I did only only give this 3 stars because it starts out really, really strong, and then it seems to sort of lose its way in the middle and meander. It was really interesting at first, and then it just sort of seemed to be a bunch of loosely, barely connected stories once you kind of hit the middle of the book. It wasn't my favorite nonfiction that I've ever read. It was still interesting, especially if you have an interest in libraries as like an institution, the history of libraries, or if you just love reading books about books. And the next book I read was A Rogue of One's Own by Evie Dunmore, and I give this 4 stars. This is the second book in the League of Extraordinary Women series. Started with Bringing Down the Duke, and I love this. I love this series. I love this book. I actually loved this book more than the first one, which I was surprised about. This is quite a bit longer than the first one and is actually quite a bit longer than your typical romance. Large swaths of it are focused on Lady Lucy's own character development and not just the romance that she has with our hero. A general overview of the series is that there's a League of Suffragists in London, and their mission is to have the Women's Property Act, or the Marriage Property Act, repealed. The basic plot of this book is that our main heroine, Lady Lucy, is looking to purchase a newspaper so that she can disseminate feminist texts to the female population of England, and it turns out that when she gets everything that she needs to get what she thinks is going to be majority share in this newspaper, her long life rival, Lord Ballantyne, ends up getting equal shares of the paper. So they now have to work together, and they are very much at odds. If you've read the first book, you know that Lord Ballantyne is a bit of a rogue, and Lady Lucy is very, very dedicated to the suffrage cause. So there's a little bit of an enemies to lovers, a little bit of hate to love in this, and I loved the whole thing. Like I said with Bringing Down the Duke, there are things in these historical romances that I think if it was a contemporary romance, I'd be like, ooh, I don't know about that. That's kind of sketchy. But because it's a historical romance, they kind of hit different a little bit. I'm really, very excited for the 3rd book in the series to come out in September, which is super exciting. I have it pre-ordered. I'm ready. 4 stars to A Rogue of One's Own. Fun romance. The next book I read in April was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. Now, I did already talk about this book a little bit in my mid-year freakout tag because this was actually one of my most disappointing books of the first half of 2021. Now, I say that not to say that it's a bad book. It's not. It's a very good book, and I gave it 3 stars. So objectively, like, it's not bad. It just was not amazing. It was not fantastic. It was not mind-blowing. It was not earth-shattering. And that's what all of the hype around this book kind of led me to believe it would be, that it was going to be this life-changing favorite of all time. And I just don't think the book quite lived up to the hype for me. Now, again, that's not to say I didn't enjoy the book. I did give it 3 stars, so I had a decent enough time with it. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue follows our main character, Addie LaRue, who makes a deal with what is essentially the god of darkness, the devil, in the 17th century to avoid being married off. The catch of this deal that she can live forever is that she will never be remembered. So the story is her traveling, trying her best to leave a mark on the world, even though she is immortal, and the different people she meets along the way until she does finally fall very much in love with someone. It was a good book. I would recommend picking it up. Like, don't let me dissuade you from reading it if you haven't already, but I just think the hype was too high. Like, there was no possible way it was ever going to meet the expectations. It was never going to live up to that. The next book I read was the 3rd and final book in the Brown Sisters trilogy, and that was Act Your Age, Eve Brown. I gave this 4 stars. I really, really loved it, and I did end up really just loving this series as a whole. I gave 4 stars to Get a Life, Chloe Brown, 3 stars to Take a Hint, to Danny Brown, and 4 stars again to this book. And I just think that Talia Hibbert has a really amazing way of creating these dynamics that you just want to root for, you want to see get together, and her humor is so spot on. All of these books were really hilarious. So Act Your Age, Eve Brown is about the youngest sister of this family, Eve Brown, who is flighty. She doesn't really know what she wants to do in life, and so she has a tendency to start things without ever finishing them because she is ultimately afraid to fail. At the very beginning of the book, she decides that she's going to quit once again, and her parents finally say, you need to act your age, Eve Brown, and you need to figure it out, go be on your own. So she storms off in a huff and ends up at a bed and breakfast where she meets our hero, who is the manager of this bed and breakfast, and essentially convinces he and his best friend to give her the job of the cook at the bed and breakfast. and it's their romance and her also learning she can succeed and she doesn't need to be afraid to fail. I love the dynamic between these two characters and I thought it was really well done. And just overall, I'd really recommend this series. I think it's great. Next, I read what is probably one of my most fun recent reads, and that is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. This is creature horror, cinematic thrills. This is killer mermaids murdering the entire crew of a History Channel Ancient Aliens-esque documentary, and everybody trying to figure out if this was all part of a larger History Channel hoax or if it was real. I loved this book. I love the way that Mira Grant, Shauna Maguire, A. Deborah Baker, I love the way that she writes. I think the way that she structures her stories and puts the words on the page feels so much like you are reading a movie, which is just phenomenal to me. It just makes it so easy to breeze through her books and really visualize everything that's going on. And of course, I'm a sucker for creature horror. I'm wearing my Mothman shirt right now, which you can't even see. I love cryptids. I love creatures. I love things that go bump in the night. And this is one of the best that I've read. I highly, highly recommend picking this up. I think it goes without saying that this was a 4-star read. I read a graphic novel for school, and that was... After that, I read a graphic novel for school, and that is New Kid by Jerry Craft. This is a middle grade. It's about a young boy who is accepted into, I think, a charter school, and it's his whole first year at the school trying to make friends and confronting the fact that the school is primarily white when he himself is mixed race. I thought it was an interesting, fun read, and I thought it was very mature for a book that's middle grade. But again, because it was a school book, I did not rate it. And then next, and I've been dying to talk about this since I mentioned it in a previous video, I read King of Scars and Rule of Wolves by Leigh Bardugo. This is the King of Scars duology that immediately follows the Six of Crows duology and is the continuation of the Grissaverse series. Now, I gave King of Scars 3 stars and Rule of Wolves 4 stars respectively. I loved Rule of Wolves so much more, and I think that is the case for almost everyone who's read it. I think I share the general consensus that I feel like Leigh Bardugo bombed her world building a little bit with this, but I really liked the character development in it, and I think Rule of Wolves was perhaps one of the most fun fantasy conclusions I've read in a really long time. Not the best, but certainly the most fun. I really enjoyed seeing all of our favorite characters. Thought it was great. Can't really say anything about either of these books because they are the 6th and 7th in a series. I think if you haven't read these books and you are putting them off maybe, I would do it because Rule of Wolves kind of is worth the King of Scars setup. Next, I read Tracks by Louise Erdrich. This is a book that I read for school, so I didn't rate it, but I did actually really enjoy it, and it is a book that I think I will come to again, and I do want to read more of Louise Erdrich's work. This book is very surreal. It is a fictional recounting of the events when the US government started demanding that they pay taxes on these very specific parcels of land, and it's how this fractures the community and creates these interpersonal struggles as this younger generation wants to be closer to the white colonists and the older generation wants to maintain their traditional ways. And throughout this whole storyline, there's also this undercurrent of fabulism, of not knowing what's real or what's fantastical. I really enjoyed this book. I highly recommend it if you're looking for any kind of more modern Native American literature that explores the historical side of land parceling and things like that. But I really loved the way that Louise Erdrich wrote this, and I'm looking forward to reading more of her stuff in the future. Next, I read 2 nonfiction books back to back. They're technically not for a class, something that I read on my own time, so I didn't rate them because they were school adjacent, but I do still highly recommend them, and that is Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger by Soraya Chemaly, and Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger by Rebecca Traister. And these books both deal with the different ways that society addresses female and feminine anger. Specifically, I found them both very insightful. Of the 2, I did end up liking Rage Becomes Her a little bit more. It takes a broader look at the way that society polices female emotions and female anger a little bit more so than Good and Mad, which deals very specifically with the way that politics and media address women's anger, particularly in the context of the 2016 presidential presidential election in the US. It spends a lot of time talking about the different ways that Hillary Clinton and other female politicians in 2017 and then prior to 2016 were treated differently by media and men, despite displaying some of the same behaviors in politics. I do highly recommend either of these. I do recommend Rage Becomes Her if you want to pick one or the other. Really, really interesting and insightful nonfictions. I don't recommend reading them both in a single day. That was a little bit depressing. Yeah, super interesting stuff if you want some good feminist nonfiction. Next, I read Whereas, poems by Layli Longsoldier. It looks short, but it's actually fairly dense poetry collection. The first part of the poetry collection takes a look at Layli Longsoldier's own identity as a Lakota woman and what it means to pass that on to her children. And then the second half of the collection, which is kind of a gut punch of the whole thing, is formatted to mirror the congressional apology to Native Americans that nobody ever knew about because it was quietly signed in the back of a military spending bill. So Layli Longsoldier takes the format of this congressional apology and kind of dissects it from the perspective of somebody who is a living, breathing part of these experiences. It's incredibly moving. It's incredibly powerful. There's so many layers to this collection that if you're looking for a really intricately, expertly done poetry collection, this is one I absolutely recommend. Everything That Rises Much Converge. Christ. Next, I finished off my Flannery O'Connor Author Studies class with Everything That Rises Must Converge, and that was her final short story collection that she finished the last story of just, I believe, 2 weeks before she died, and it is by far one of my favorite things that I read from her in all of the works that we covered. If you're going to pick up any Flannery O'Connor, I recommend Everything That Rises Must Converge. The title is utterly impossible to say. I mentioned this in my last video, but I really do believe that Flannery O'Connor was someone who was a master of her craft. She was the mother of Southern Gothic literature, and her short stories always pack kind of a gut punch. They're always very multi-layered, and I really recommend it if you're wanting to get into American classics. A huge fan, would highly recommend. And then the final book I read for April 2021 was There by Tommy Orange. This book fucked me up. This book fucked me up good. It's very hard to articulate exactly what this book is about because there is just so much to it. Essentially, we're following, I think, 12 or 13 different narrators as these different people or their family members begin converging on this powwow that's being organized, and it's really heavy. This book is very heavy. It tackles every dark part of humanity that you can think of. It's a lot, but it's a masterpiece. And the prose itself is incredibly intricate. Each of these 12 to 13 different narrators have a very unique voice. There's just so much to this book, and I highly recommend it if you are looking for a really hard-hitting piece of literary fiction to add to your collection. This is one of those books that, having read for school, I would probably give a rating if I read it a second time. So far, the only books that I've done that for are The God of Small Things and Everything I Never Told You, both of which I did end up reading twice before giving them a 5-star rating. So I think I will end up reading this again perhaps next year or the year after. So I highly recommend it. And that is everything that I read for the month of April, not counting the 14 manga volumes that I did read over the course of this month. After this, we'll be getting into my summer reads, which were all for fun. So I'll be flying through those a little bit faster. And like I said, I will be putting out a video eventually at some point, kind of wrapping up in broader strokes most of the manga that I've read over the course of several months. Thank you so much for watching. If you've read any of these books or you have any thoughts, let me know in the comments down below. And as always, gamers, smash that like button. Don't forget to hit that bell, hit that subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. And remember that I love you.